So we've been looking at metabolism, metabolic pathways, we've been looking at respiration, metabolic pathways, and in this we're going to be looking at the ability of an organism to maintain its metabolic rate, and that is affected by external abiotic factors. So things such as temperature, salinity, that is how salty the surrounding environment is, and pH all affect the ability of an organism to maintain its metabolic rate. And we're going to have a look at environmental conditions. Now, different organisms live in different types of environments, and an organism can respond to these variations in two ways. One, they can either conform, so they're known as conformers, or they can regulate, so they're known as regulators. So we're going to have a look at some examples of these. So let's have a look first of all at a conformer. Now, a conformer is an animal who employs a strategy which means that its internal physiological variables of the organism fluctuate directly with the changes in the external environment. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is if they're in a salty environment, their internal environment inside the organism becomes salty. If they're in a cool environment, then their internal body temperature becomes cool. Now, most conformers, it's not, this is a kind of pretty wide statement, but most conformers, or a lot of conformers, live in the ocean where the environment is relatively stable. Now, the advantage to being a conformer is that you've got a low metabolic cost. Now, I've got this word here, physiological homeostasis. Physiological homeostasis means keeping your internal environment at balanced. So, for example, you would keep your salinity inside your body at within a certain narrow range, or your temperature within a certain narrow range. So the advantage of being a conformer, that is, you conform to the environment that is there round about you, is that it doesn't cost a lot of energy to do that. So you've got a low metabolic cost. The disadvantage to that, though, is that as an organism, you've got a very narrow range of ecological niches. You're less adaptable to environmental change. So, for example, if you are used to being in an environment that has got high salinity, a lot of salt, because you can't adapt when you go into an environment that's got a low salinity, then it narrows down the sort of niches that you can stay in. A regulator, on the other hand, what they do is they control their internal or their inner environment, and that's what we call physiological homeostasis, and I'll talk about that just shortly. The advantage to that is that you can exploit a wide range of ecological niches. So you have things like mammals, for example, that are found all over the planet in very cold environments and in very hot environments, because they control their internal body temperature. The disadvantage of being a regulator is that it takes up a lot of energy to be a regulator. Now I'm just going to have a look at this graph here on this page. This is just looking at the idea where you've got some sort of environmental condition down here, and you've got up here, it's not very clear, it's a bit blurry, but up here it says internal condition. Now, if you're what are known as a strict conformer, for example, if we were talking about an increase in temperature, for example, if you're a strict conformer, then what's going to happen is your internal temperature is going to increase. If, on the other hand, you are a regulator, a strict regulator, then it's not going to make any difference what the temperature is outside. Your temperature is going to be maintained. In the case of humans, it's 37 degrees Celsius. So you can sometimes see graphs like this, and that is what they're talking about. So we're going to have a look at an example here, which is a marine example. So in this case here, we're looking at a shore crab, so that's this character here, and on the other hand, down here we're looking at a spider crab. Now a shore crab is found in river estuaries. So I've got up here marine and estuarine invertebrates. So we're talking about an estuary. It tends to be where you've got water that contains less salt than seawater. And shore crabs are found in estuary environments. Spider crabs though spend their life in seawater. So when we have a wee look at the diagram that we've got over here, the graph that we've got over here, we've got down at the bottom here the level of salt or solute concentration in the water. In other words, the level of salt in the water. And here at this point here is a sort of seawater environment. Now a shore crab can regulate its internal body fluids to some extent, and so a shore crab is able to actually osmoregulate. That means it's able to regulate its body water content to a certain extent. So it enables a shore crab to operate in seawater and in river estuaries where water contains less salt than in seawater. So we've got a graph here that's looking at the solute concentration of the crab's body fluid. And as the solute concentration increases down here, if we have a wee look at the shore crab, you'll see that initially what happens is the line in the graph stays fairly steady. So what is happening there is that the shore crab is able to do some osmoregulation in the water, which is a bit less salty than seawater. So it looks a bit like a conformer, in fact, at this point here. But eventually, as the water gets saltier and saltier, the shore crab's ability to osmoregulate is lost. And what happens is you start to see the shore crab's internal environment just becoming the same as the seawater. And by being this regulator, the shore crab is able to exploit a wider range of environments than the spider crab, which is a total conformer. So what we're seeing here is that the shore crab is not, we're complicating, I suppose, the issue a little bit. He's a conformer, but he's also got an ability to be able to regulate as well. So he's a regulator conformer, which makes things a little bit more complex. In the case though of our spider crab here, a spider crab is an absolute conformer, and it conforms to the environment. In this case here, you'll see the animal is unable to osmoregulate. And here, in actual fact, what happens is that when they're in water that is much less salty than seawater, the animal will die. And here you'll see at this point here, as it gets saltier, oh, my line's gone squinty. The spider crab, when it's in a solution like that, its internal body becomes as salty as the external part of the external salty water. So you'll notice that the benefit of having this scenario for the shore crab is that it can survive in a wider range of environment than the spider crab can, which can only survive in this sort of level here of salt water. So we're going to move on and have a look at regulators. Now, I used the word before, physiological homeostasis. Now that's the maintenance of the body's internal environment within certain tolerable limits despite changes in the body's external environment. And that regulation is brought about by a negative feedback control, and it needs energy. Now, negative feedback control, what we're talking about here is that when some factor affecting the body's internal environment changes or deviates from the normal optimum level, or what we would call the norm or the set point or optimum level. So if that changes at all, either positively or negatively, then what happens is that sends out messages to via the nerves and or hormonal messages, and these messages get sent out in turn to effectors, and those effectors could be a gland or they could be muscles, something like that. And what happens is that they bring about some sort of corrective mechanism to enable everything to get back to the set point or the norm. And it may be, like in this circumstance here that's in the red, you could be talking about an increase in temperature, and receptors pick that up and the effectors respond, and the internal body temperature goes back to the normal. Or it may be a decrease in temperature, as in this example over here. So we're going to have a look, since I've mentioned temperature, at thermoregulation, which is an example of physiological homeostasis. Now, before we do that, I'm just going to talk about some differences in thermoregulation. So you've got two different strategies here as well, where you've got conformers and you've got regulators. And we've got these words here, an ectotherm. Now, an ectotherm is an animal which isn't able to regulate its heat by physiological means. So it's not using physiological homeostasis. They get most of their body heat by absorbing it from the surroundings. And an example of that would be reptiles. Sorry, you're hearing my dishwasher draining in the background there as I'm making this recording. Reptiles, invertebrates, fish and amphibians are almost without exception ectotherms, and their body temperature normally varies directly with that of the external environment. On the other hand, the opposite of that is an endotherm, and that is an animal which is able to maintain its body temperature at a relatively constant level, independent of the temperature of the external environment. And all birds and mammals are endotherms. And they have high metabolic rate, which generates most or all of their body's heat energy. We know that most enzymes work best at 35 to 40 degrees Celsius, and animals that can maintain their body temperature within this range possess an efficient and active metabolism. And here's the sort of graph that you see with looking at the difference between your ectotherm and your endotherm. So here in the example here, we've got the snake down here, which is the ectotherm, and as the ambient, that's the surrounding temperature, increases, then the body temperature of the snake increases. On the other hand, when it comes to the bobcat, well, the body temperature stays relatively stable. It's a little bit lower when it is colder, but not anything, drastic here. So it's just maintaining that body temperature at the level that is required. And here's another example here where you've got your fish ectotherm, and again, its body temperature is affected or changes with the temperature round about it, whereas your river otter is an endotherm. It regulates its body temperature to keep it relatively constant. Now we're going to have a wee look at how this is done, and looking at us as humans. We're really looking here at an area in the brain called the hypothalamus, and we could call that really the body's temperature monitoring centre. It's a wee bit like a thermostat. So if you've got a thermostat and a boiler, or say on a water bath, for example, in the laboratory, you set the temperature at 40 degrees Celsius, the water bath heats up the temperature to 40, and when it goes above that temperature, the water bath switches off, because there's a regulator in the water bath that detects that. So the thermostat that's in the water bath will switch off the heater. Now, as the water starts to cool down, what will happen is that will be detected by the thermostat and the heater gets switched on. So in the same way, the hypothalamus, it receives impulses from the environment, from receptors in the skin. They detect heat and cold. And also as well, the hypothalamus contains thermoreceptors, which detect changes in the blood temperature. And that will reflect in turn changes in the body core temperature. So you get information being sent from receptors in the skin, and information as well that comes from the temperature of the blood in the body. And the hypothalamus will then send out messages and in order to control various parts of the body to enable the internal temperature to come back to the normal if it's moved off the norm or the optimum or the set point. And it sends out messages via nerve impulses to various parts that are involved in this: the sweat glands, the skin, the hair, erector muscles and skeletal muscles, and we'll look at that in. So let's have a wee look at that thermoregulation process in the human body. So maybe you've got a situation where you've got an increased body temperature. It might be that the climate is hot, or you've been exercising, and the blood is warmer than the hypothalamic set point. So that activates the heat loss centre in the hypothalamus, and messages are sent out to the various parts of the body that are involved in body temperature control. So first, we're looking at here that the skin, the blood vessels in the skin, at the surface of the skin, they will dilate, and that means that all the capillaries there, they become flushed with the warm blood, and that heat in that warm blood can then radiate from the skin surface. That's why you go bright red when it's very, very hot, or if you've been exercising a lot. Also as well, what happens is that the sweat glands are activated and perspiration is secreted, and that helps to as it evaporates off the body, that helps to cool the body. In turn as well, and that's not on this diagram here, is that the erector muscles that are on the skin, that are involved with the hairs on the skin, they relax so that the hairs on the skin just lie flat, and that makes sure that heat isn't being trapped in that layer of hair there. And as a result of all of these things helping to cool the body temperature will start to decrease, and the hypothalamus heat loss centre shuts off, and homeostasis, or normal body temperature, results. If on the other hand you find yourself in a colder environment, then the blood is cooler, and that activates the hypothalamus, and what happens is that the blood vessels, the skin blood vessels, they constrict, and blood is diverted from the skin capillaries and withdrawn to deeper tissues. So that minimises heat loss from the skin surface, and you know that happening yourself. If you're out in the cold, you start to see, your fingers can go white, and that's because these blood vessels are constricting and the blood isn't up at the surface of your skin. In turn as well, the sweat glands aren't activated, so you'll not be perspiring, so you're not losing, as that water is evaporating, you're not losing body heat. Also as well, the muscles, the erector muscles of the hairs that are on the skin, they constrict in order for the hairs to stand upright, and that helps to trap a warm layer of air next to the skin. That can help as well. Also, in addition to that, messages are sent to the skeletal muscles, and they start to contract, so you get shivering, and the idea behind that is that heat could be generated by that shivering, and so therefore what happens is the body temperature starts to increase and comes back to normal. Now obviously if we're talking about really, really extreme environments, then this mechanism cannot override that. So if you find yourself plunged into a -20 degree lake of freezing, or of ice or whatever, then you're not going to be able to keep maintaining your internal body temperature. But within a reasonable circumstances, you are able to do that. So looking at the next slide, just a little bit of a recap of that. So overheating, you get vasodilation, that is these blood capillaries that are here, they will open up and dilate, and heat can be lost from the surface of the skin. You get an increased rate of sweating, and the water on the skin surface evaporates, so that helps to lose heat. And you get relaxation of the hair erector muscles, and that prevents heat being trapped in a layer of air next to the skin and allows it to escape. I haven't said this here, but you get a decrease in metabolic rate as well, so you're not producing as much heat yourself. When it comes to overcooling, well, you've got the opposite happening there. You've got vasoconstriction, so that the capillaries near the surface of the skin constrict, so you get less heat lost by radiation. You get a decreased rate of sweating, so that reduces heat loss by evaporation. The hairs on your skin are raised, and hence you get goose bumps. And those hairs help to trap a layer of insulating air to reduce heat loss. You get an increase in metabolic rate in order to produce more heat, and you've also got shivering. The idea behind that being that you'll produce heat. And that's the end of this video on conformers and regulators.